Thank you, Austin. And thank you all for being here with us this morning. We got an early start at 8 a.m. and I recognize several of you have been here since that time. It's an accomplishment in this weather, I know. So thank you. We really appreciate your being here. I'm going to talk a little bit about this morning about Harry Truman's and George W. Bush's contributions to the national security state. Our oceans have ceased to be moats, which automatically protect our ramparts. Flesh and blood now compete unequally with winged steel. War has become an all-consuming juggernaut. If World War III ever unhappily arrives, it will open new laboratories of death, too terrible to contemplate. This from the famously isolationist senator from Grand Rapids, Michigan, Arthur Vandenberg. Senator Vandenberg, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee after World War II, had come to understand that in a post-Pearl Harbor world, he could not return to his antebellum isolationism if the government was to live up to its constitutional mission to ensure the domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, and secure the blessings of liberty. The new global context demanded an unprecedented degree of peacetime American engagement abroad to fortify our national security at home. So when President Harry Truman looked to solidify American internationalism through membership in the newly framed United Nations and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, through the Truman Doctrine to aid free peoples and the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe, he found a natural and indispensable ally in Senator Vandenberg of Grand Rapids. 60 years hence, the challenge of national security is even greater, despite the work that Truman and Vandenberg set in motion. Today, the challenge of managing information alone requires enormous resources. Bradley Patterson, who served 3 presidents in the White House, wrote in 2000 that departments and agencies of the national security community generate some 500,000 communications each day between Washington, U.S. diplomatic, military, and intelligence posts abroad. We know the vital elements of national security: foreign policy, military policy, and domestic security policy, coordinated and informed by the best possible intelligence. Hans Morgenthau, the author of American Realism in Foreign Policy, first suggested during Truman's years in the White House that strong institutions are also indispensable to national security. We inherited a State Department from the Founding Fathers, an institution to manage foreign affairs. As we shall see, thanks to Truman's National Security Act, passed again with an assist from Vandenberg, and President George W. Bush's Homeland Security Act and his Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, today we have executive departments that manage military and domestic security affairs, and we have the deliberative councils in the White House to coordinate and at times implement national security policy. Let's start at the beginning of what has been called the national security state. How important was the National Security Act to Harry Truman? On July 26, 1947, his sister Mary Jane telephoned him to say that his mother, Martha Ellen Truman, had pneumonia and might not make it through the day. Truman ordered his plane made ready. He quickly traveled to the airport for departure and then delayed takeoff for nearly an hour. Why? A few congressional signatures were needed on the National Security Act before Truman could add his signature and make it law before Congress recessed. He didn't want the act delayed any further, so he waited. Finally, the act arrived, Truman signed it, and minutes later he was airborne. But while he was still in the air, Truman received word that his mother had already died. 6 years after the surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the National Security Act was intended to, quote, provide a comprehensive program for the future security of the United States, end quote. Up until that time, institutions involved in the national security were disorganized and divided. Ferdinand Eberstadt issued a report on behalf of the U.S. Navy in 1945 acknowledging gaps between foreign and military policy, between the State Department and the military establishments, gaps between strategic planning and its logistical implementation, gaps between and within the military services, gaps in information and intelligence between the executive and legislative branches of our government, between government and the people. The Act sought to close these gaps in several ways. First, it established the unwisely named National Military Establishment, NME, enemy, which consisted of the U.S. Army, Navy, and the new Air Force that was also created by the Act. Second, it established a relatively weak cabinet-level Secretary of Defense, charged with exercising general direction, authority, and control over enemy. Third, it founded the National Security Council to advise the president with respect to the integration of domestic, foreign, and military policies. Over the years, especially under Nixon and Kissinger, the National Security Council became the nexus for the most powerful cabinet members and advisors to shape foreign policy and respond to international incidents. Fourth, the act created the National Security Resources Board to coordinate military and domestic agencies for wartime mobilization. And finally, the act established the Central Intelligence Agency and the Office of the Director of Central Intelligence to oversee the agency and the broader intelligence community. Although the National Security Act raised fear among numerous Americans that Truman and the 80th Congress were creating a garrison state, complete with an American Gestapo, the final work was a considerably watered-down piece of legislation. It was a compromise bill, Johns Hopkins' Charles Stevenson reminds us. The struggle for the National Security Act is too long a story to be told here today, but I'll tell just the most dramatic part. The unification of the military in Washington was the toughest item on Truman's national security agenda. It dominated the contentious public debate, took years to resolve, and finally ended when one of unification's greatest opponents revised his position shortly before diving 16 stories to his death from the Bethesda Naval Hospital window. In fact, the debate over unifying the military so dominated the public consciousness that barely a peep was raised over the CIA or NSA. The United States Army and Navy, both older than the Constitution, had been commanded separately since their inception. In wartime, joint planning had often been necessary, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff had been created just for that purpose during World War II. But in Washington, the two had always been administered separately. Now, the need for a stronger cooperation and coordination between the Army, Navy, and the emerging Air Force was acknowledged on all sides, with President Truman arguing convincingly with support from the Army that a unified Department of National Defense would simplify the budget, create efficiencies, facilitate coordination, reassert civilian control over the military, an important point, and lead to better research, training, and planning. I have a feeling, Truman told his staff after VJ Day, that if the Army and Navy had fought our enemies as hard as they fought each other, the war would have ended much earlier. Navy Secretary James Forrestal opposed unification as Truman and the Army envisioned it, largely to protect his own branch's turf, and proposed instead bolstering efforts at cooperation and establishing a relatively weak Department of National Defense. The logjam was broken when the president demanded a compromise and accepted several of Forrestal's reservations and recommendations. The catch was that Truman appointed Forrestal as the first Secretary of Defense and told him in essence to live with the office he had created. It didn't take Forrestal very long to change his mind. I was wrong, he told White House counsel Clark Clifford. I cannot make this work. Nobody can make this work. Still, Forrestal gave the job his best for 2 years, but its rigors drove him to a nervous breakdown. Biographer David McCullough writes, afflicted with insomnia and loss of appetite, Forrestal appeared strangely drawn and aged, his shirt collars too large for him. Some days he would telephone the president several times on the same subject, which left Truman mystified. At meetings, he would unconsciously scratch at a particular part of his scalp until it turned raw. Forrestal finally resigned his position on March 29, 1949, and 2 months later copied these lines from Sophocles, warned by the waste of time, comfortless, nameless, hopeless save in the dark prospect of a yawning grave. And then he jumped 16 stories to his death. Secretary Forrestal's breakdown and suicide shocked the nation and added urgency to the 1949 amendment of the National Security Act, which Congress passed and Truman signed that August, 5 months too late for Forrestal. The amendments replaced enemy with DOD, the Department of Defense, and created a stronger Secretary of Defense as well as deputy and assistant secretaries to aid Forrestal's successors. By the time Harry Truman departed the White House in 1953, our modern national security apparatus had been born. The State Department was joined in the executive branch by the Department of Defense, the National Security Council, and the CIA.